Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm rich primary teachers. This week, I am excited to bring you an episode all about stress and the role it might play in the classroom. Now, we might not always consider stress as a positive thing, but in this interview with Dan Rosen, we're going to explore exactly what role it plays. I absolutely loved this conversation. I loved the talk at Research at Deutschland that it came from, and I can't wait to share it with you. So without further ado, let's spend some time thinking deeply about primary education. So this week, I'm delighted to be joined by Dan Rosen. It's great to have you here, Dan. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Now, we always begin with our guests and numbers to get a feel for who they are. And so my first question to you is years as a teacher.
Just over 12 as a teacher in schools, but I taught a little bit before at university as well. So I don't know which one you want.
I mean, it's entirely up to you how you interpret that question.
Yeah, so just over 10 in schools, and then I was teaching at university for what, 4 years, maybe? Not as my sole job, but whilst I was doing my PhD, I was doing a bit of teaching, teaching master's students, undergrads, that sort of thing.
Nice. I mean, I think the idea is the same, isn't it? I know something they don't.
Yeah, absolutely. I think teaching undergrads is far easier. They're expected to come with a lot more preparation, and they ask really interesting questions, and it feels more like a discussion. I think that's what we're trying to aim for as we get towards Key Stage 5, but certainly less planning is involved in your teaching university.
Years as a school leader?
Oh, what do you mean by leader? As in a leadership position or as a senior leader?
Any leadership position.
Oh, eight. I was head of year 11 as my first leadership role. Yes, about 8 years.
Blog posts published?
I was looking at this the other day. I've only published 7 blog posts. I was on Twitter for about 10 years before I did absolutely anything, tweet or otherwise. And yes, I'm only up to about 7 blog posts.
Blog views?
Just over 2,500. I'm hoping to get that up at some point, but pretty happy.
I mean, that's a really good ratio. What your blog address? Musings of a Doctor?
Yeah, of a DR.
WordPress?
I like to think my initials are DR, and I'm a doctor, so I thought Musings of a DR is me, and Musings of a Doctor is also me. So yeah, that's what it is. WordPress, yeah.
Most important year group?
Good question. At the moment, I'd say year 1, but let my daughter go through year 2, and I'll let you know. But yeah, I've seen what she's gone through this year, and knowing, obviously, I know year 7 to 13 pretty well, but I think primary, anywhere where they're building foundations, I think they're the most important years. I see what progress she makes, but more importantly, like the foundations for the approach to being in school and all that sort of thing. Yeah, for me, it's got to be year 1 or year 2.
Favorite year group?
12. That's easy. You get to delve into some really interesting things, some topics without kind of any pressure of external exams for us. And I don't know, there's this kind of, they've chosen my subject at that stage. They're really interested in it, and they just want to learn. They're eager, and they haven't kind of hit university pressures, hit exam pressures, and all that sort of thing. So yeah, that's my favorite year group.
And number of tweets?
Oh, under 1,000. As I said, I for a good decade or so, I didn't tweet a thing. But yeah, I don't tweet that much really, but I do consume quite a lot on Twitter.
Nice. I think you might then take the mantle of lowest number of tweets, which is an esteemed honor.
Wow. I'm quite happy with that.
It gives us a really nice range between highest and lowest now.
Who's the highest?
So Steph Elliott, who's a teacher from Newcastle and maths subject leader, and she has over 100,000, maybe over 120 if I remember. She was season 3. Yeah.
Wow, that's a lot.
But she's a prolific book blogger as well. So people will give her their books, and she will sort of talk about those. So Dan, you're a teacher, scientist, perhaps biologist is the better word to use.
I mean, I'm a biologist as a teacher, but I suppose I'm technically a pharmacologist is my training. But yeah, now I teach psychology and biology.
School leader, and most recently the organizer of Research at Deutschland. Tell us about your journey and how you got here.
Oh, like many young people, I went to university, didn't really know what I wanted to do, but knew I was really interested in neuroscience. So I did a course that now doesn't exist, which is lovely. It was called PPP, Physiology, Psychology and Philosophy. And I kind of chose options around to essentially study psychology and neuroscience. I did that as my undergrad, loved it. Then got the opportunity to do a master's in pharmacology. I was particularly interested in how drugs affected the brain, and kind of I wanted to learn more about that. So I went to pharmacology, and then I kind of stayed at university, did a PhD in pharmacology. I was looking at intracellular calcium signaling, specifically looking at how neurons grow, which is all of this got nothing to do with teaching so far. And then I kind of had an opportunity to teach undergrads in kind of seminars. I did labs with them, teaching medical students how to, do labs work on animals and things like that. And I really loved it. I just fell in love with teaching. And I kind of, at that point, I was deciding, should I stay in research? Should I go and do something else? And then I was really lucky to be offered an opportunity to go and kind of teach at a school, Wellington College. And I kind of took that with both hands, saying, okay, well, let's try this, see how this goes. If I don't like it, it's not the end of the world. If they don't like me, it's not the end of the world. I finished my PhD, let's do it. And then I never looked back. I absolutely fell in love with teaching, everything about it. Teaching the students, planning lessons. I actually quite like marking. It's kind of like doing research. You kind of get your results and then you're like, well, what can I do with this now? And so that's how I view marking. And I did a lot of rugby at Wellington. And yeah, that was it really. Became a teacher from that point onwards, never looked back. I did a PGCE with Buckingham as a GTP. And then as part of that, I did my placement at the Wellington Academy. I don't think it's called that any longer, actually. And then I was offered an opportunity to go and be a member of their SLT down there. So I was in charge of curriculum and assessment, amongst other things, including exams and things like that. So yeah, that was my first foray into senior leadership. I forgot to say, at Wellington, I was head of year 11, head of biology as well. And that kind of, I absolutely adored that leadership aspect to my job. And then, so yeah, when I was offered the opportunity at the academy, I took it with two hands again. And then Brexit happened. My wife is German, and I don't know, it just kind of, this opportunity in Germany came up, and it was a head of secondary. It felt like the next logical step in my career. I'm not sure I was ready for it, but I put an application in, and I was successful, and I was obviously over the moon, and it kind of, everything came together. So now I'm in Germany, St. George's in Düsseldorf, and yeah, I've been here 5 years now. And so the first few years, you adjust to a country, you adjust to the school, you learn about it, and you kind of make slow plans. And we've kind of reached a stage now where the school is really, really thriving. We're really happy. We've just got our, best ever IB results. And the staff body are doing some amazing things, and we're kind of ready. We were ready to kind of up the level of interaction we have with the wider community. Everything's in shape in the school, but we need to push ourselves. We need to learn, and what better way to do that than hosting a research ed conference? Loads of the staff in the school are already active on social media and kind of engage with research to kind of inform their practice. But we needed to kind of expand on that rather than drip feed it in, because we, as I said, we're ready for it, and that was it really. And then the rest is history. We hosted the conference, and now we're talking online about what I talked about.
Yeah, and I think for me there are hundreds of wonderful talks at Research Ed, but yours was probably the most interesting that I've been to, because I was coming from a position of extreme novice, but the way you delivered it made it so accessible, which I think is the mark of a successful sort of session. And so the first thing I had to do as soon as it finished was obviously congratulate you and then say, can we talk about this more? Because I think anyone who listens to the podcast will be really interested to hear about this.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to hear. Yeah, I mean, I hope that the listeners find it interesting. I think, I picked stress as a topic because it's something that we all know ourselves are, that feeling of stress. We all know how it affects us, and we all kind of have this impression of how it affects students. But actually, the reality is obviously it's messy, it's complicated. But I think sometimes the research we have and the evidence around it kind of simplifies things a bit for us. It makes our lives a bit easier and not have to worry so much about stress.
The focus of this chat will be stress, but as stress has colloquial connotations as well as sort of educational and physiological connotations, what do we mean by stress?
Yeah, good question. I think, when we talk as a biologist, a stressor is something that is a change in the environment that your body has to respond to. And your body does that fairly easily, fairly normally as part of homeostasis. Your body regulates your internal conditions kind of automatically. It's really very straightforward. What we kind of mean by stress in this case is something a bit more than that. It's where you're perceiving something to be a bit of a threat or a challenge, something that actually your body can't just deal with very easily, and you're going to have to be a bit more proactive about it. The challenge here is that actually you've got your brain is kind of assessing the context, assessing the situation, and is making a decision to say, actually, this is stressful. And that's kind of triggers off this whole kind of cascade of internal processes that kind of make you then feel stressed. So there are two main aspects to a stress response, and the first one is called fight or flight. I think most people have kind of heard about that. And so whenever you kind of are a little bit scared or afraid or feel threatened, your brain, you're kind of processing the information. And then actually there's a decision that's made that says, we need to do something different about this. We can't just let this be and kind of hope that it kind of sorts itself out. It might be there's a bear in front of you and just standing there's not a great plan. You want to do something. And so your brain makes the decision and says, okay, this is stressful. And you're interpreting the signals that are coming into you and saying, this is time to do something different. And so you set off this kind of fight or flight mechanism. And that's really quick. It happens via your central nervous system, and then you release some hormones, and suddenly, boom, you are ready to fight or run away. And ironically, the physiological process is pretty much the same thing for both fighting and running away. Heart rate increases, your blood pressure increases, you start to sweat a little bit, you send all the blood to your muscles and away from your digestive system, and you're kind of focused in on the threat at hand. You're kind of getting rid of all the distractions, and your attention is directed to what it is you need to be dealing with. And that's kind of a very kind of immediate stress response to a threat. I think the challenge we have is that everyone perceives different things as stressful, and everyone responds to stressful things differently. And so we have a real challenge as teachers, as humans, really kind of understanding what stress may mean for different people before we even look at the biology of it. The second part of stress is slightly longer term, or takes a little bit longer to get going. In the grand scheme of things, it's still pretty quick. We're still hitting maximum stress at about 30 minutes. And that's it's called the HPA axis. And essentially, this is where we have stress hormones like cortisol going around the body to kind of change the way your body is acting to, again, allow you to deal with this stress slightly differently. Again, your heart rate might stay elevated, but your metabolism will also change. And that's kind of really important. If you are being chased by a bear, you don't just want to be able to sprint away from it. You need to be able to give your muscles sufficient glucose and oxygen to make sure you can continue to run away from the bear. It's kind of a very evolutionarily old adaptation, this kind of stress response. And that takes typically longer. And when someone is stressed, both of these things will happen to a greater or a lesser extent. And how we deal with it is different, as I said before, for each person. But that's kind of what we mean by stress in this context. It's kind of that immediate reaction and the slightly longer or slightly medium term response. What we don't mean about stress is chronic stress or some form of stress disorder. I don't think I'm qualified to talk about those sorts of things. And they are actually, really significantly more complicated than a straightforward stress response, and have real long-term effects on the body and the mind as well. But I suppose the context of my talk at Research Ed and what we're going to be talking about today is kind of that the normal stress response, which most people go through when something is challenging or threatening or a little bit scary, and then the body's response to that, and then how that affects our memory.
That's a really clear distinction and fascinating. I could listen to you talk about that all day. From what I took from your talk, there seem to be two key areas that we can examine the impact of stress and its relationship with learning, so to speak. And the first appeared to be the encoding process. What role does stress play in that encoding process?
Yeah, for me, this is probably the most interesting because it's the slightly counterintuitive role. People think, okay, when I'm stressed, I can't learn anything, I can't do anything because all I care about is the stressful event. And actually, I think the research suggests this might not actually be the case. Some of the early research suggests that actually stress might not even be a hindrance, it might actually be helpful. One of the classic studies, it was in the mid-90s, was showing how actually when you prevent a stress response from happening, when you're hearing a story and you're trying to recall aspects about it, when you prevent the stress response by using a drug called propranolol, actually you prevent the memories or things being remembered. And it's really interesting. It's linked really closely to arousal. And I think this is where we kind of can't look at stress in isolation. This study was looking at arousing stories, and actually it was the arousing or the memory of the arousing story that got prevented or kind of decreased. And so in this case, the stress response is actually kind of mediating the encoding of those memories when someone is aroused. And by aroused, I'm talking about a positive emotion to a situation. And so we already kind of, for a long time, have known that preventing stress kind of prevents arousal mediated memories during the learning phase. And there's been quite a lot of research on that since. We can artificially induce stress by giving people cortisone. Not necessarily the most ethical thing to do, but it has been done quite often. And again, when we give people cortisone to mimic a feeling of stress, actually their memory improves, especially for cued recall. And so we kind of have this basic idea that when we artificially manipulate the stress response, we can increase or decrease memories accordingly. And the initial indications are that actually stress might be helpful for memory encoding for us, that during that initial learning phase, if we are slightly stressed, actually, do you know what, we're more likely to remember things. It is quite intuitive because of the link with arousal. When people are positively aroused, actually they tend to remember better. We've known for years that emotions are linked to memories, and there's some really wonderful classical studies in psychology about how emotion can help people remember. But actually, it's not a surprise. If we're having an emotional response to a situation, we may get a little bit stressed by that, even if it's not, super bear scary. It might be a little bit threatening, but actually that seems to have a positive effect. And I think from that point onwards, once we knew that, it was all about seeing whether that actually applies in real life, because it's all very well injecting someone with cortisone or giving someone propranolol to reduce their stress, but that's not actually what life is like in the classroom. That's not what life is like when you're walking down the street. And unsurprisingly, I think, it's easy to say that in hindsight, there's been loads of studies suggesting that actually it's the same when you induce stress in a kind of a real life situation way. There's quite a few stress tests, making people put their hands in cold water and not show pain, or making them give a speech, for example, about something they don't know about in front of lots of people who are judging them. We can do all kinds of things to put people in stressful situations, and pretty much quite a significant number of studies have shown that when we do this, we see the same effect on encoding. We see that actually there is a slight positive impact, especially when there's positive arousal as well. We can see that there is this kind of improvement in memory when the stress happens during the encoding phase. And so it feels counterintuitive. If people are a little bit stressed, then actually their memory improves. But that's what the research says. And most importantly, there are very few studies that show that stress around encoding inhibits memory. And I think that's actually, for me as a teacher, that's probably one of the most important lessons there, is that actually, even if students are a little bit stressed, it's not going to make a negative impact. And so I don't need to worry so much about it. If anything, the stress is going to be a little bit helpful. And so I think it's really interesting when you actually start to look at what stress looks like in the learning phase, the encoding phase. It can be slightly helpful.
The counterintuitive nature of some of the most important things in education has come up actually a few times this season, but also over the last 15 years of my career. Some of the most important things I've learned, I have initially rejected because of how counterintuitive they were. So, I'm almost maybe a bit more open to what you're proposing, because I know that actually there's normally some leverage. I mean, if anyone's interested in going to the source material, what's your, like, this is the paper that will provide you access to all of the other papers?
There's a really good review article in Nature Science of, I can't remember the actual paper. I can probably find it if you give me 2 minutes. But it's by Schwab and one of her colleagues. They're actually based in Germany, actually, but they've done a lot of work on this. And there's a really nice review article. And now I'm under stress. I'm under pressure. I'm not going to be able to find. I'm not going to be able to find it. Oh, here we go. I've got it. There we go. It's in the Science of Learning. It's Nature Neuroscience of Learning. It's by Schwab and Vogel. So Suzanne Vogel and Lars Schwab. Sorry, Schwab is Lars Schwab. And there's a review article in the Science of Learning. I think it's published in 2016. And that kind of takes you through kind of a very brief history of what we've learned about stress in the classroom. It's called Learning and Memory Under Stress, Implications for the Classroom. And if you read it yourself, you'll see a lot of the studies I've kind of focused in on for my research ed talk. And it's really interesting. There's actually loads more stuff in there that I wanted to include in my talk, in terms of how actually under stress you switch different, you process information differently, and you use a different system to learn when you're under stress. I didn't get to talk about that. It's actually quite complicated, but if you have the time to look at it, it's fascinating stuff. The idea that your brain uses a different mechanism or a different process to kind of deal with decision making, as it were, and that therefore has a knock-on effect on memory as well. So Schwab and Vogel are certainly my go-to people when it comes to stress in the classroom. They've written some wonderful stuff. They've done quite a few studies on it themselves as well.
Fantastic. I know that listeners love a keystone paper, because then that opens the doors to many different directions. So they'll be really grateful that you share that with us. The other aspect would appear to be the retrieval process. So when we're trying to sort of retrieve those memories that we've made, from our long-term memory, what role does stress play in this process?
Yeah, I think this is where this is more intuitive. It's not good. Stress is shown, obviously, and I think I don't like using anecdotes, but I think we all kind of know anecdotally that when we're trying to remember something under stress, I've literally just demonstrated it. Actually, we struggle to retrieve information, and kind of when people are stressed, they certainly perform worse on memory tests. And there's quite a lot of research out there. It's not a surprise. If we artificially give people cortisone again, we really impair their ability to recall aspects. And interestingly, it doesn't really have an effect on recognition. I can come to that later, but certainly on free recall, stress has a real negative impact on your ability to do that.
So what would the distinction be then between those two?
So if you imagine, if I'm asking you to remember who you saw yesterday in the supermarket, and I asked you to describe them and just gave you free recall, you would have to think hard and then say, okay, I remember seeing a lady, she was wearing a blue dress and had a black jacket on. And you might be able to do that for one or two people. Recognition, on the other hand, is when I show you some pictures of people and say, who do you recognize? Who do you remember seeing yesterday? And it's kind of, one is acute recall and the other is less, is pure free recall. And I think it's really important when we talk about recall to distinguish what we are talking about, because I think one of the, and I kind of made this, I alluded to this in my talk, one of the reasons why students, I think, go to the easy option of rereading notes before exams is because it makes them feel comfortable. Gives them this feeling of, no, I do remember. It's okay. I'm cool. Do I remember the equation for working out speed distance time? Do I remember that? I'll look at my notes. I'll go, oh yeah, I remember seeing that. I've seen that before. Brilliant. Okay, phew, I do remember. That's very different from sitting there with a pen in your hand and saying, how does speed, distance, and time relate to each other? Because one puts all the onus on you, and the other one is just, can you remember having seen it at one point, at some point ever? And it's really interesting that the stress doesn't have an effect on that recognition. And therefore, I think it kind of interlinks with those students saying, okay, I've seen it, good, comfort, and they decrease their stress themselves. But that is really important distinction, because when we're doing memory tests, it's important what memory we're looking at. And all of the studies that look at retrieval look at both, or most of them look at both, because they want to make that decision. And what you find time after time after time is that stress around the time of trying to retrieve, be it 0 minutes, 25 minutes, 90 minutes before, it always has an impact, a negative impact on the ability of people to recall. What I do find interesting actually is at the beginning I said, there's two kind of main mechanisms of physiological stress. You've got the fast one with via your nervous system and adrenaline and noradrenaline, and you've got the slower one with cortisol. And what they've tried to do is try to work out which is having those effects. Obviously, I think it's not surprised that both have a negative effect. But what I think is really interesting is that there are some studies that show that even after the cortisol is gone, there's still a negative effect. And for me, that's fascinating, because if we're looking at how can we combat the effects of stress, just removing the stress and calming people down isn't going to be enough. Even after the cortisol has gone out the body, people are still feeling the effects of it. So our strategy to try and make people not feel the effects of stress, well, first of all, it's going to last 90 minutes anyway, so that's the length of an exam if you're talking in secondary parlance, but or even longer than a double lesson. So you can't do much about that anyway. But even after the fact, just the act of calming someone down and bringing their cortisol levels back to zero, getting their heart rate back to zero, actually, that might not even make a difference, because the effects of the stress on the retrieval has already happened and will continue to happen because of other mechanisms that are now kind of happening as a result of your initial stress response. And so as a school leader, as a teacher, how can I prepare my students to not feel stressed when the moment they felt stressed, it's over? I can't do anything after that point. And I think for me, that's the next kind of question. The next stage is what can we do to prevent students feeling stressed in the first place, rather than just looking at a way of calming students down, although obviously that is important.
I mean, it feels like our bodies are geared up to make learning the most impossible task, or certainly retrieval.
I mean, it's certainly not necessarily what we've evolved to do, but we are actually fairly good at learning. And I think if you imagine that the actual learning phase is fine, like you say, that's stressful, that retrieval, it feels like we're not geared up to it. But actually, I think we are. And I think this is the kind of, again, slightly counterintuitive given everything I've said. Actually, we are built to retrieve. We are just built to retrieve things that we know really well. And I think this is where we come to the question of how do teachers, or how can teachers help students mitigate the effects of stress when they're trying to retrieve? And I think all the evidence points to low stakes retrieval practice. I know this comes up quite a lot in many aspects of teaching and learning, but there are two main studies which I think are fairly well known kind of in the Twitter sphere, but maybe not necessarily well known enough in schools. The biggest one for me is the Smith study that looks at the effects of retrieval practice on the effects of stress in terms of memory. And this was done in 2016, actually, at the same time. And it is a really, really impressive study, because they kind of, I mean, in psychology, we talk about making sure that you counterbalance and that you make sure your groups are independent. And if you're doing repeated measures and all these kinds of things, you have to take into account. But it's a really elegant study where they compare retrieval practice with, and they call it study practice, which is essentially rereading. And they kind of do this, they group the individuals really well, so that they all have to learn things in one order or a different order. They get quizzed on one order or a different order. And at the end of it, they end up with a beautiful way of showing that actually retrieval practice essentially prevents all the negative effects of stress. And for me, if ever there was a reason to do retrieval practice, that is it. We're looking at a way to prevent students from we're looking at a way to increase students' ability to do well in exams or to do well in tests. But if stress is one of those reasons why they do badly, well, hang on a second. We have really strong evidence to suggest that retrieval practice prevents the effects of stress, and significantly so in kind of all situations, be it in a non-stressed or a stress situation. And so I think as a teacher, going through all of the research and looking at everything about how stress affects the body, this one study on its own tells me as a teacher, what can I do to prepare my students for exams, for tests? And this is applicable to not just, year 13s, year 11s. We're talking about every single student here, because we don't know how students respond to stress. We don't know what causes them to be stressed. Why are we making an assumption that that kind of 10-minute quiz on a Thursday, period 3, is any less stressful than the big GCSE exam, the first exam that's coming up in the session? The point is that we can't control that. I have no way of knowing that about my students. But what I do know is if I do low stakes retrieval and I practice it often, then my students won't feel the effects of stress, even if they have a stress response. So even if they are physiologically stressed, it doesn't affect their memory or their ability to recall. So that's what I can control. So that's what I should do. And for me, that was this paper kind of on top of all the other evidence about retrieval practice, on top of everything else we know about retrieval practice, this for me was the game changer. It was we're basically saying it doesn't matter if you get stressed, because you're still going to be able to recall. And so back to your original statement, you said we're not geared to retrieve. Actually, I think we are geared to retrieve. We're geared to retrieve when we've practiced lots and when we know we can retrieve. If I put you under immense pressure and said, can you remember your name? You'd have no problems. If I said your date of birth, you'd have no problems, because you do it all the time. And I think that's the key here, is we need to make it so that the retrieval is just normal. It's what we do, and it's what we've done 100 times before. So I'm not stressed about it because I know I can do it.
That's brilliant. You've almost got this, the different branches of science are coming together to support, on top of the psychological work that we've had in retrieval practice. We're now thinking, okay, we can put the body and the psychology together to make something really, really robust. I mean, just out of interest, what would your ideal retrieval practice setup be? Would you be looking for all of your teachers? Maybe hypothetically, if you don't want to talk about St. George's.
I mean, I think obviously, I'm not going to be foolish enough to say that every single subject does it in the same way. I'm one of the most humbling aspects of being a leader is understanding the differences and the nuances of each subject and how they approach memory and kind of retrieval in that sense. I think probably as a primary teacher, you're probably more acutely aware of the subtle differences between those subjects. But when we start to say, we could debate all day about the difference between knowledge and skills. But I think for me, what I would like to see is that we are consistently asking students to retrieve information about things they've just learned, about things they've learned a little bit ago, and about things they've learned a long while ago. And by consistently, I mean not necessarily every lesson. It doesn't work if you've got a science double practical. A science teacher, I'm a science teacher. I'd say, hang on, I've got 100 minutes to do this practical, and I know it's meant to take 110 minutes. I've not got time to do my retrieval practice. Okay, fine. But in reality, we're talking something every opportunity. Why not? Because we know from that it's going to help students link things to, if we're going to talking about retrieving something we've done recently in terms of building our schema. Equally, if we're talking about space learning, we need to make sure that we are consistently revisiting these things. So I would say regular and often. I know that still probably not really answers your question, but I would include in that, and I do this myself as a teacher. I ask them things like, okay, well, how would you go about answering this question? I'm not asking them the answer to the question. I'm saying, how would you approach it? What does the mark scheme say you need to do? And I know this is fairly kind of key stage 4, key stage 5 heavy, but asking students to say, well, okay, well, what does an evaluate command term? What does that mean? Can you recall the different things that need to go into an evaluate answer? And can you recall what goes into a discuss and what goes into a compare and contrast? Because if you can recall those things, then in the exam, you're sitting there and you see evaluate, you don't panic and get scared and not remember, because actually, one of the biggest things students do is they write a perfectly lovely answer, but doesn't answer the question. And I think, so for me in my school, I'm expecting my staff to look at retrieval for that element too, because that's an important element in an exam, but it's also an important stressor. What does evaluate mean? Oh my God, I can't remember exactly what I need to do. Is it strengths? Is it limitations? Is it and if they can't do that bit, well, it's over. It doesn't matter how good they can recall everything else. And so I think, it's about putting everything in place so this becomes the norm. This becomes the habit. We're teaching students to do this at home. We've moved away from projects whereby, we get students to do a piece of research for homework. Okay, that's great. It's lovely. It's interesting. And there is a time and a place for that. Totally. But actually, what we need to be doing is encouraging students to do self-quizzing at home, because actually, if they're self-quizzing at home, they get all the retrieval practice benefits and they get into good study habits, and it just makes their life much easier. If you're asking them to do things that they can just look up on a computer, or they can just ask their friends to help with, well, that's lovely, and there are times and places for that, but that's not the kind of the study and the learning habits that we know from psychology will help, and it also is not going to help us at all with the stress element. So so back to your original question: regular, often, as often as possible, if only just to kind of stimulate kind of the process of generating our schema to build things on, hang things on. If that's the only time we do it at the beginning of a lesson, that's better than nothing, and I'd rather something happens than nothing happens.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. Built into the practicalities of school life.
Yeah.
I mean, Kate Jones was at Research at Deutschland. She's got lots of ideas, particularly in the second book. When I read it, there were lots of different ways. So it wasn't always necessarily a quiz, but there were ways to encourage retrieval in different scenarios. So I think you're absolutely right. Now, this next one might be a bit of a loaded question, but in my opinion, many often poorly referenced articles suggest that stress brought on by a timed element, for instance, has a negative impact on learners and the learning process, to the point where we shouldn't ask them, for instance, to memorize their tables through retrieval practice. Listening to you, it feels like those statements and such statements contradict the available research. What do you think?
I think, yeah, I would say the timed element is not a concern. I'm not going to say for every student, as I said at the beginning. We don't know how everybody responds to stress. We don't know what everybody's physiological response to stress is. But I think for the majority of people, during the learning process, that timed element isn't going to have a negative effect, and it might have a slight positive effect. Therefore, you've got to say, well, okay, it's not going to have a negative effect. So what would the reasons not be to have it? And if the reason not to be is because you might have someone who might end up having a stress response, okay, I think we should deal with that on an individual basis with that student, to help them through it, because actually it could be really beneficial for the other students. I think you've also got to remember that this is but one aspect of teaching. And any experienced teacher will know that if you don't start to set time limits, things drag on. And actually, you've got to have some kind of plan to your lesson. Everyone has a plan to their lesson. Well, if you're just going to let things drag on because you haven't set that time limit, well, that is another factor you have to consider. Now, that doesn't mean you have to time everything to the second and to the minute. That can feel very regimented. But certainly for me, during the encoding process, a timed element would have no negative effect, or maybe it might do for some students. But actually, the positives certainly outweigh that. And again, it gets them used to that stress. It's a retrieval practice. We're getting them used to it. Ideally, the retrieval practice should be low stakes. I mean, I think all the evidence points to a retrieval practice as low stakes is far better than retrieval practice high stakes, because actually, if it's retrieval practice high stakes, it just suddenly becomes an exam, and we want to avoid that. But again, we can normalize timed. If the normal routine is this is timed, then that's okay. As students will get used to that over time, and we can make that part of the low stakes testing. I think to blanket and say timing is bad, I mean, we time break times. Do people get stressed out about the timing of break times? No. Do they get stressed out about the time of lessons? No. Do they get stressed out about the time they have to play on an iPad? No. Okay, so, in the grand scheme of things, what is the stressor? What is it that's causing the stress to those students? The timing element? You've only got 10 minutes to answer these 10 questions? Or is it the fact they've got to answer the 10 questions? Because if we use positive language, and I talked about positive arousal early on. If we're using positive language to talk about the timed task we're about to do, well, actually, we're likely to see more benefits. If we're saying, okay, you've got 10 minutes, this task is going to take 10 minutes, and you're going to answer as many questions as you possibly can. I want you to have a real good go at it. We're already kind of positively arousing the students, and that's going to have a positive effect on memory. That is very clear. And actually, the timed element can be part of it. It's just part of it. See how far you can get to, and then you can use that if you want to as a challenge for some of your students who like a challenge, and say, okay, last time you answered 5 questions, this time 6. Great. Or you can say, don't worry about it. It's all good. We're going to just do as many as we can, and be positive either way about it. So for me, I don't know. I think if we're going to talk about stress specifically, I don't think there's any strong evidence to suggest that the timed element will have a significantly negative effect because of stress. And I think, therefore, the decision should be about how else you want to set up your classroom, how else you want to set up your lesson, and everything else about it.
I hope I haven't thrown you under the proverbial bus. If so, just push them my direction. It was all my fault.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to be a conflation, like you were saying at the start, between stress, as you've defined it for this conversation, and almost long-term sort of stress conditions. Then, I don't know if disorders is the correct word. Like anxiety.
Yeah. I think when you're looking at long-term anxiety disorders, or even something really specific like PTSD, as teachers we are woefully inequipped, and actually it's not fair to ask us to deal with that. It takes psychologists and doctors a really long time to help people deal with those things, and to think that we can magically have a solution for those students is impossible. It doesn't mean we should ignore them, of course not, but there is a difference between having a diagnosable disorder or a long-term chronic stressor at home. There are many things that cause chronic stress, that difficult home lives, all kinds of things which we cannot, we would love to have an influence on, but as an individual teacher in your classroom at that time, can you take that into account? I'm not sure you can. And is it reasonable to expect people to do that? And I think, therefore, let's focus on that kind of a student stress because they haven't done their homework and they know they're going to have a quiz in it. That's one type of stress that we can look to deal with. Are they stressed because they've just had a fight with their best friend? Are they stressed because they've got paint on their dress and they know that it might not come out? Those things are normal, everyday stresses, which understandably stress kids out. It's not a problem. But should we be taking that into account, or should we be using that to our advantage? And I think that's the difference for me. I wouldn't want to say, oh, don't care about stressing kids. That's definitely not what I'm saying. But I think we're talking about two very different things here. We're talking about kind of long-term chronic diagnosable stress conditions, or something really, really acute, a bereavement, something like that actually is far out of the realms of this conversation. That is a whole different ball game. To stresses in the classroom, things that will stress students out, but that we can deal with and we can utilize.
Quite naturally, you have filtered in things that are helpful to the teachers in the classroom. Is there anything else we can do to introduce the optimum level of stress into our lessons?
Oh, yeah, that is a good question. I think, if I'm honest, I'm a pragmatist, and I would say our best bet is not to worry. Actually, if we start going into the minute details of what we can do, the time and effort it's going to take to plan around stress, I think we're diverting time away from something else that could be more useful. I think the very fact of the counterintuitive nature of this is that it's not going to be harmful, but it might be beneficial. I think for me is enough to say, look, leave it. Don't worry about, is this going to cause stress for these 3 students, or how can I? It's a lot of effort for potentially not much gain. So I would actually say, look, the best thing that we can learn from all of this is don't worry about it. Best bet is just do your task. What do you think is the best thing to do to help these students learn this information, to retrieve this information, to practice using this information? Plan your task. Don't worry about the stress during the encoding phase.
Teaching can be pretty stressful. And again, I'm talking about raised cortisol levels as opposed to something that might necessitate time off work, for proper treatment. Is there anything that you think you've said or that we've covered that can help shape our behaviors to use stress as a force for good in our in our own roles in the classroom and in school in general?
Yeah, I honestly, yes. I wrote a little blog post about it in terms of a leadership context. I think the answer is we should practice what we preach. If we're asking students to do low stakes retrieval practice because it will help them remember stuff, and when in a stressful situation, it will mitigate the effects of stress. Why don't we do that as teachers? And I wrote my blog post from the context of a leadership position in terms of drafting emails to parents, in terms of practicing challenging conversations with staff and students, because by doing that deliberate practice, be it retrieval or anything else, we are putting ourselves in a situation that when it becomes stressful, even though we will definitely be stressed, we can still retrieve the information that we want. And especially parent meetings for me, that's a huge stressor, because you're in a room with someone who cares the most about a child, and obviously as schools we care about children deeply as well. But sometimes there's conflict there, even though everyone really does want the best thing for the student. And so that's a very, very stressful situation for everybody involved. And knowing what you want to say, practicing what you want to say, practicing with a member of staff, that email, what does that look like? That can even though I'm going to feel that stress in that moment, actually I can still say what I need to say and what I want to say. And the same thing applies in the classroom. The same thing applies to teachers. Are you practicing those explanations of really tricky things? Because there's nothing more stressful than explaining something to a class of students, then everyone going, nah, have no idea. Can you explain that again? And then you go, oh, well, that was the only explanation I had. Am I going to repeat what I just said? That makes no sense. Now I'm stressed. Or what do you do when you're following the behavior policy and a student, doesn't follow what you want to do, and now you're stuck? Well, what happens next? Have I practiced the steps in the behavior management policy so that I know what to do when, little Johnny does X, Y, or Z that I have never encountered before? And so for me, it's about deliberate practice, that kind of, whether it's retrieval or otherwise. And I think that's why you often see these kind of experienced teachers who kind of look as though they're so unstressed. Well, actually, probably because they are. If you've taught a topic 100,000 times, actually, no, maybe not that many times, but you know what I mean. If you've taught it a significant number of times, actually, you have 10, 20 explanations in the bank. And when 3 different children need 3 different explanations, you're not stressed. You've done it before, easy peasy. But for the ECTs, not only have they never planned this lesson before, not only have they never taught it ever before, they probably never thought of the misconception that they're all going to have, and the different ways they're going to need to do it. So, if we're asking what we can do for teachers, well, let's practice. And as leaders, what can we do for our staff? Give them a space to practice. CPD doesn't just have to be going on a course. It doesn't just have to be, are we going to rewrite the scheme of work or look at this curriculum? Why can't it be, let's practice doing this explanation? Okay, what possible misconceptions are there going to be? What's your new explanation? How are you going to tackle that? Let's practice that in a safe environment, low stakes, like retrieval practice. Let's do it. Let's do it again and again and again, because that's the sort of CPD that's really going to help someone not feel stressed about walking into a classroom. At my end, you often see the stress coming at exam classes. Am I preparing my students well enough? Have I explained this? Or the course has changed. I've never taught this topic before, and it's really difficult, and I never learned it when I was at school, nor when I was at university. All of those things are stressful. So let's practice, 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 like the students. Practice what we preach, low stakes retrieval, low stakes practice, because when it really counts, we can then do it, even though we will still have the stress response.
Yeah, whenever you were speaking, that was the first thing that came to mind, was the idea that sensation of being a teacher for 10 years, having things mastered and having so much committed to memory, and how can you almost shortcut yourself there? So I think, yeah, I'm going to link that blog post, and then any early career teachers, can look at the principles, but equally you might have a chance over the summer to write an ECT specific blog post that we could post as well.
Oh, yeah, okay. I've got some time over the summer. Yeah, I'll try and do something. Oh God, now you put me under pressure. But yeah, okay, good idea.
Yeah, there's quite a stress-inducing episode recorded.
Indeed.
June, we had a wonderful time in Dusseldorf. You had some fantastic speakers, and I mean, all the people there were really keen to engage with evidence-informed practice, and lots of wonderful conversations. What does the future hold for Research Ed Deutschland?
We hope to have another one. Certainly, look to do another event next year. I think, as I said right at the beginning, the reason we're kind of ready to do something like this is because the school and the staff are ready. They use research to inform their practice, but actually, I think Germany as a whole, there are some amazing schools. We've got some amazing schools, international schools and non-international schools. But there's a huge kind of hangover of old practices. I have had, in my 5 years, I've had more conversations with parents than I care to think about learning styles. It is taught, or was taught, like it was in the UK, in German teacher training. Students undergo learning styles assessments to understand their learning style. And when parents come and say, you haven't assessed my child's learning style, it's like, oh wow, this is, okay, where do I start with this? And part of the reason why, again, we invited parents to our event, and a few did come, which was fantastic, because actually we have a duty to bring that kind of evidence, not just to our teacher community, because that's all very well and good, but actually to the wider community. And I mean parents, students, and also, even some schools in the vicinity or a bit wider afield, because I don't know, we often get hung up on competitor schools or things like that. But for me, we're educators. We want all of our students to do well. And if something like learning styles is so prevalent in a country, I think we have a moral imperative to resolve that situation. And then the next question is, well, if learning styles is happening, what else is happening, and what else don't they know? and I don't think anyone's foolish enough to say that we've got all the answers from research. Far from it, but at least we're having those conversations. So what do I see next? I hope it gets bigger and better. I hope COVID can not decimate some of the attendees, which would be nice. But yeah, so next steps, I'd love to do another one next year, get a bigger variety of speakers, have more people attend, just to kind of open up the world of research informed practice to the wider community. And if staff can just take away 1, 2, 3 things that they then go and implement, then it's all been worth it.
So it's almost habit forming. Once people in Germany realize this is going to happen every year, they'll want to get involved more and more and more, won't they?
I hope so. I really hope so. And I hope that we've also sparked, we had a couple of people from the school speaking, and when colleagues, we have a sister school in Cologne and Munich, and when colleagues see kind of staff from Dusseldorf speaking, they're like, well, hang on a second, this is what's happening in your school, I can do that too. And suddenly you start this kind of, and it's not even about being competitive, it's just the kind of, you open this option. There is this option to go and speak about what fantastic things you do in your classroom, and then you get to go and hear other people do it. And like you say, it's this kind of snowball effect. And if people can kind of really, if people know it's a fixture and they know that they can come and they can get, a whole whack of CPD in one day and speak to so many amazing people and make so many connections, well, it can only be a positive thing for everybody involved. And so, yeah, I'm really excited about it. It's been fantastic for the school. I really enjoyed it, and I know that staff got loads out of it, and it's been really eye-opening for some, honestly, but it's been really kind of refreshing for others to say, hang on a second, no, I do that. I do that already, and I am using the research correctly, and what they've just said is exactly how I use it. This is amazing. Maybe I'm better than I thought it was. Maybe actually, do you know what? It gives them a bit of confidence, and I think all of those things are fantastic outcomes.
Nice. And I everyone who was there could see how tirelessly you and your team worked to organize it. So I'm sure everybody in attendance was extremely grateful. If I said that I had the power to grant you any speaker in the world, but they would have to present all of the sessions, so it's almost like a one-person research ed monkey paw offering, so to speak, who would you request?
Oh, as in selfishly for me, or who do I think would be best served for the community? Because
maybe both.
Maybe both. I mean, okay, I'll go for the community. If I was to have one person, because I know that they would be able to give so many sessions that would be amazing. I have to pick Dylan William. There's no other way around it. I can't see past him. I mean, I think he'd be fascinating to hear talk about a variety of different things, and he's so grounded and so measured, yet at the same time so insightful that I think staff would get something out of every single session. So if we're talking about the community, I'd pick him. On a selfish point of view, it would have very little to do with teaching, but it might have quite a lot to do with education. I pick someone like Sam Friedman. I think he'd be fascinating to hear talk. I mean, I know he doesn't just talk about education, but just understanding the back end machinations of kind of policy and the reality and what was thought of and expected and then reality. I think he would be a fascinating person to hear speak about a multitude of things. But I also think, and this is going to be, I was thinking about this, who would be the most challenging for myself? I don't know if you know her, but she's called Kate Finlayson. I don't know how I got followed her and we follow each other, but she home educates her children, and but she's deeply involved in kind of edu-Twitter, and her take on it just challenges me to think better and to think more deeply about things, because it's such a different approach to schooling to what I'm involved in, and yet everything she says is really considered and thoughtful, and you're like, actually, yeah, do you know what, we should be thinking about these things more. So, you know, I'm not so necessarily she's a big name like Dylan William, but I think she's someone who I think would speak very measuredly, considerately, and would challenge everyone to rethink their approach to how we see education.
Nice, great choices, great choices. You know, I think you've definitely covered all those bases, and yeah, it'd be fantastic listening to Sam Braven talking. Yeah, so what, 6 sessions in a day? I'd definitely do that if he was doing all
just
6 sessions.
Just one long session, just one really long session.
Imagine.
Yeah. Oh God. We need lunch. But other than that, it'd be great.
I mean, it's been fascinating, start to finish. Is there anything you think teachers need to know about stress and its impact on learning in the classroom before we sort of wrap up?
I think one thing I didn't mention at the beginning was kind of what is the biggest cause of stress in a real life situation. You know, we talked about, you know, injecting people with cortisone, and we talked about giving people drugs to prevent stress. But I think one thing I forgot to mention was the kind of the big meta-analysis done in 2004 about the causes of stress. And I mentioned it kind of at the beginning of my talk, Research at Deutschland, which was the idea of there being two major things that cause stress in young people, and that's social evaluative threat and uncontrollability. And I think this is important for teachers because it kind of highlights that the two biggest things to cause stress are the things that happen in schools on a daily basis. So social evaluative threat is where there's a risk that some aspect of your identity could be judged negatively. So if you think yourself as clever and there's a chance that others will think you're not clever, then that causes major stress. If you think that you're good at football and there's a chance that people will consider you not to be, major stress. And it applies to everything. Do they think you are good at doing X, Y, or Z, and there's a chance that you're not? That causes so much stress that you'd actually rather not do it. And the idea that you are being evaluated by your peers is one of the biggest causes of stress in all the research that's on stress that's been done, and that's the result of a meta-analysis on that. That sounds awfully like school, right? Think about students in school. They care most about what their peers think, and so if we're putting students in a situation whereby their peers can judge them, then that is going to be stressful, which I think links back into this idea of low stakes retrieval practice. We need to lower the stakes. We need to make it not about judging people for being clever or hardworking or good at something, because when we do that, there's that kind of threat of being evaluated by your peers. But it's also important because we don't want to highlight when someone gets something wrong. So we talk about how we're going to do low stakes retrieval practice. Doing it on a mini whiteboard where you can rub it out or where only you can see it is key. Not asking people to peer assess each other. Peer assessment is a wonderful tool for helping students to give feedback to each other, but also to kind of learn about the marking process, etc., etc. But if you're placing a student and saying, right, you're going to do this, and then that your peer is going to look at this and mark it, that can be awfully stressful. And suddenly you've ramped up the stress just before you're asking students to retrieve something. So hang on, why are we doing that? If we're doing retrieval practice and we want it to be low stakes, let's keep that down. Let's keep that stress level down and say, okay, you're going to do it. Only you are going to see it. Only you are going to mark it. It doesn't matter whether you get it right or wrong, but you're going to do it because the act of practicing is the thing that's going to help you improve. And there's loads of things about, test enhanced learning. And there's loads of studies out there that, the very act of just having a guess actually can help you improve your memory long term. And so we don't need students to see each other and how well they do, we can keep it super low stakes and remove that socio-evaluative threat. The second thing I would say is about uncontrollability. So that's the second biggest cause of stress, whereby response behavior, if I do X, Y happens. That's huge control. If I do X and I know Y is going to happen, brilliant. But one of the biggest causes of stress is if I do X and I don't know what's going to happen, that stresses me out. Well, if we know that, then let's be consistent. And I think this is one of those things we haven't really talked about behavior management much. But the reason why clear behavior management policies work, in part, is because obviously they're easy to follow, but two, they decrease the stress for the student. If I throw my pen across the room and I know that I'm going to have to do, I don't know, I'm going to have to leave the room or I'm going to get a detention, yeah, okay, I can still choose to do it, that's fine, but I'm not stressed about the outcome. If you're stressed about what the outcome is going to happen, then you kind of really kind of playing with the student's physiological response to stress. Okay, maybe throwing a pen across the room is not the best example, but let's say if you fail a test, you don't know what's going to happen. Am I going to ring home? Am I going to tell you off? Am I going to, if I ask you a question, you can't answer it, and it was based on the homework. If you don't know what's going to happen, if the outcome could be that I shout at you for not doing your homework, or if the outcome could be that I mock you, or the outcome could be that your peers laugh at you, well, that's not great. That's stressful. If the outcome is, it doesn't matter, no worries, thanks for having a go, brilliant, let's move on. Look how brave that was, fantastic. We use positive emotions. Well, that's significantly less stressful. I'm actually not advocating for cold calling when it comes to retrieval, but certainly cold calling for aspects is part of our daily kind of approach to teaching and learning, and cold call has its place. But if the outcome of that cold call is unknown to the student, they are going to be stressed. So I think for me, I forgot to mention this right at the beginning, but I think it is hugely important that the reality is there's two main things that cause stress, and that's socio-evaluative threat and uncontrollability. And what we can do to minimize those two things in the classroom can go a long way to decreasing the stress response, which by definition will help our students retrieve information. So sorry for not mentioning that sooner. I probably should have done. But I hope that's also useful to people listening.
No, I think they're almost like the threads that tie everything together. So I think it's a really good way to end. It's almost, okay, you've got all this information, but here are two things that are really, really important. Like you said, sounds just like school.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for joining me today. It's
No
been a real
worries.
pleasure.
Thank you very much, Kieran. It's been, I hope the listeners find it interesting. I hope that I've performed well enough on camera. That's been stressful, but no, it's been a really enjoyable experience. Thank you so much for having me on. Genuine pleasure, and I look forward to staying in touch and talking more.